Wilma.
Go ahead, Wilma.
I just want to say, I'm looking at your screen share. There is no center, and that's the problem in our country these days.
Yeah, and so obviously the question is what constitutes the center, right? And so why don't I start there? And you may recognize that this is a slide that I've modified from a previous lecture just a few weeks ago, in which I was worried that our institutions might not rescue us from our politics. And now I'm adding, right, that our institutions and our norms may not rescue us from our dangerous politics in 2024. And I'll say immediately, if our politics drift in a violent or authoritarian direction. And so what is the center that this poem, right, that the line is drawn from? Things fall apart, the center does not hold, right? I've got it a little bit weaker, but what is that center? And I think the poem, and I think my own reference today is not just to institutions. I've already observed that our Supreme Court, our Constitution, given the way in which it's being altered by the Supreme Court, our political parties, given the choice they've presented us with in 2024, our media system, given its incapacity to bring the discourse of politics back to some minimum standard of verifiability or plausibility in the information it circulates, that all of these institutions are failing us. But today I want to suggest that there's another institution that is not legally expressed or enforced. That's the institution of our political culture. And if there's a center to the tradition of liberal democracy in the United States, and it's an uneven, unsteady, imperfect tradition, but it's perhaps one that has been moving in a gradually, if unsteady, progressive direction over a couple hundred years. If there's something that has both held and sustained these institutions and that tradition, it is the political culture of the United States, and in particular, a culture. I'm going to refer to the Italian Marxist political theorist Antonio Gramsci, sitting in a jail in Mussolini's Italy, writing in his notebooks. He says, among other things, that democracy is valuable because in a democracy, people settle their disputes by casting paper stones, not actual rocks at each other. And of course, by a paper stone, he meant a ballot. At that point, you literally cast a ballot into a box. And the idea that we will have our sharp, vehement, heated, principled disagreements with each other, but we will resolve our differences through peaceful, open, fair electoral contests. And when this works well, not only will we avoid violence and rely instead on our capacity to persuade each other to vote for the side we prefer, but we will elect members of both parties or several parties to Congress. And then in order to legislate, they will have to discuss their differences with each other, deliberate, and maybe learn a little bit from each other. Maybe recognize, wait a sec, the person that I'm now stuck in the committee with for a couple years, they're not as completely wrong-headed as I thought. Maybe they have a lot of bad ideas, but they're also a decent person. And so at least I can try to convince them that they need to change their minds. And maybe in the process of entering that conversation, I will actually change my mind too. That's what it means to be in conversation with someone, right? Is in a environment where we're trying to deliberate or persuade each other, and the result might be that I detect some decent ideas from the other side and incorporate them into my politics, that I soften some of my disagreement and that I incorporate some learning into my position. And so the culture of democracy in the United States, as flawed, as imperfect, as biased, as racist, as discriminatory, as sexist, as um, how should I put this, as biased in favor of the already or hitherto privileged as it has been, has nevertheless also sustained a practice that has allowed us, with important exceptions, to very often peacefully settle our disagreements. I worry. It's been a week since we last spoke, and in the intervening week, so much has happened. But among the things that have happened is that there was an assassination attempt on the former president of the United States and the leading candidate to be the next president of the United States. And it is, I'll just say, thank God, the case that he is all right. That the assassin's bullet, which did graze him, which did take a piece of his ear, which bloodied him, nevertheless, an inch in the other direction, a second later in his turning his head. And I want to say, not only did Donald Trump dodge a bullet last Saturday, but the United States of America dodged a bullet. And here I'm looking at political history and noting that when major violence occurs, political violence occurs in a society, very often it spins out of control. Very often it's very difficult to contain. And please note, of course, that Donald Trump himself has been prone to violent rhetoric. His followers are steeped in a kind of messianic vision of a struggle against a deep state, which may be evil, and in which Donald Trump is their savior. If he had been martyred a week ago on the eve of the convention that was going to nominate him for the third time in 12 years, third time in 8 years, to lead his political party. You add to that many of his followers are armed and armed with military grade weapons. I don't know what would have happened, but I certainly don't think it would have been anything but destructive for our democracy. And so that's the place I want to focus today. But as I've alluded to, this has been a week incredibly dense in political developments. And where do we start, right? With the assassination attempt. But then maybe we should add that 2 days later, Judge Aileen Cannon dismissed the documents case and did so on the basis of a holding that is a radical and, to my mind, incredibly implausible understanding of the law, but one that was encouraged by a concurring opinion by Clarence Thomas in the case of Trump v. the US, the immunity case, right? And so now one of the major criminal cases pending against Donald Trump has been dismissed. It will be appealed. It may be reinstated. We'll have to see how radical the Supreme Court is. But the consequence of this, among other things, is that Donald Trump got a major gift at the very outset of the convention nominating him, and that the radicalization of the federal bench is all the more evident. In the same 24-hour news cycle, Donald Trump announced that JD Vance is his vice presidential pick. And so we'll need to talk a little bit more about that. And more or less a day or two later, Joe Biden, his rival for the presidency, the current president of the United States, contracted COVID, had to withdraw from the campaign trail, and did so amidst growing pressure for him to withdraw from the presidential campaign and allow somebody who appears to have a greater capacity to conduct an effective campaign to take the argument to Donald Trump, to win, and to do so in a way that bolsters as opposed to diminishing the chances of down ballot Democrats. That pressure keeps mounting. But Joe Biden, I had hoped that the retreat to Rehoboth Beach from Washington might remove him a little bit from the, I think, siege mentality of the last few weeks and give him some time maybe to meditate on what the statesmanly thing to do here is, to maybe look at the example of George Washington, really two examples, turning in his military command as soon as the Revolutionary War had concluded, being dubbed the American Cincinnatus as a result, and then stepping down after 2 terms as president. A relinquishing of political power when it is better for your country often distinguishes the statesman from the typical politician whose vanity or greed for power keeps them in the chase after it is no longer realistic for them to succeed or healthy for the polity for them to continue. I had hoped maybe COVID would be an opportunity for this to begin to dawn on Joe Biden, but I'm not sure. Like you, I'm just reading what the press is reporting. I guess that Joe Biden is quite bitter, maybe understandably so. Maybe this is not fair, but please note, Joe Biden is one of 300 million Americans, and he's one of, right, less than 50 of us who've gotten to be president. He doesn't deserve a second term unless it is the case that the American people want him to have a second term. And it is quite clear, I think, that not only do they not believe he's capable, but that his case for being president has been sorely diminished by his seeming decline over the last, and then it's years. But in particular, the inflection point is clearly the performance of the debate, and the confirmation for so many Americans of their suspicion that he has given his all to the country for 4 years is as a result diminished by it and no longer has the capacity to perform well in 2024, let alone in 2029. So those are the topics for today, and the synthetic lens through which I want to view these diverse topics, each of which could be the subject of an entire discussion for an hour among us, is the idea that the center may not hold. Maybe there is not a center anymore, that our institutions and norms are so badly frayed and decayed in 2024 that we are now beginning to really have to reckon with the need to repair them if we're going to stay the course. So let's get into it. And so we watched the Republican National Convention over the last week, and I want to start with some observations about the delegates, about the ordinary people attending the conference. And obviously, one of the things we get to see when we watch a nominating conference is how the people on the floor are accounting for their attitude, their mood, their belief about their candidate. And I think it's quite clear that there's really is a messianic fervor that has been there for quite a while over Donald Trump. He's not just a charismatic leader. He is in many ways regarded by his followers as the savior for them from a corrupt, and I want to use the religious language, evil society and government that needs to be fundamentally reformed in a kind of prophetic way. And the fact that he came within an inch of dying 2 days before this convention began, the fact that as opposed to being in the morgue or convalescing in the hospital, he was there on the first day, bandaged, but it's a minor bandage and entirely intact. It's a flesh wound, right? This indicated to them, as they put it, I found one way that a delegate put it particularly revealing, that God was not through with Donald Trump, that he therefore saved him because Donald Trump still has work to do on earth for America, right? And so we will have to see what the implications are of many of the adherents of a single candidate increasingly believing that he has a kind of messianic mission. But having said that, I also believe, and I will just say, I think Donald Trump in many ways is candid. He speaks his mind. And so when he also said that God Almighty saved him, I believe he may be beginning to believe what his followers believe about him. I don't believe he necessarily believed that until quite recently, but it may be that he's internalizing not just the adoration, which he clearly loves, right, of his followers, but this idea that he is in some way messianic. He chose JD Vance, and I want to say a fair bit more about this choice. And I'm going to start with the idea that JD Vance in 2015, 2016 wrote this very interesting, and it's kind of a memoir. It's also a work of political and cultural criticism, Hillbilly Elegy. And I want to really try to distill the core message of Hillbilly Elegy to its most concise form. The message was the working class, the white working class, the Midwestern Appalachian white working class was to blame for its decline, for its deep problems, that the lack of valuing education, the lack of a strong work ethic, the decline of the family, the increase in out of wedlock births, especially having children young and having more children than could be supported economically, the turn to alcohol and drugs and guns, that this was part of a culture, and it was a cultural explanation for why the white working class had declined. And that same JD Vance, right, a product of Ivy League institutions, management consultant and venture capitalists who had been cheek and jowl with many elites, but nevertheless came from a different social background and had a different political ideology, for many of them who were much more privileged and inclined to be much more liberal, that this was the position that Vance was staking, and that in 2022 he runs for the Senate in Ohio, having completely disavowed all of those ideas. In 2024, having bent the knee several times to Donald Trump already, he is Trump's pick for the vice presidency. And please note what Donald Trump says about the white working class in the United States. He says quite directly that it's not your fault, right? And he then adds, by the way, let me give you some other people to blame. It is the liberal elite who have done this to you because it benefits them and because they don't care about you. It is the immigrants who the liberal elite have allowed to come into your country, to flood your country, to take your jobs. And the liberal elite, because of their liberalism, prefers the immigrants to you. They consider you to be deplorable, right? It is China, who the liberal elite signed trade agreements with and welcomed into international institutions. And as a result, China has taken your jobs, right? And I don't just want to say that obviously of these two political messages, a message that doesn't blame you, but gives you someone else to blame and says that you are blameless is the more attractive and successful political message. And so as a matter of expediency, it made a great deal of sense if JD Vance wanted to succeed politically for him to convert from his prior cultural conservatism to Donald Trump's anti-institutional and scapegoating message. I also believe, and I don't have tremendous evidence for this, but it appears to me that JD Vance actually believes that he was wrong when he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, and that Donald Trump was right, and that is a credible position. I want to differentiate here the institutional explanation for the decline of the white working class from economic security, in which perhaps prosperity was in the future, if not for yourself, maybe for your descendants, to economic precariousness, in which the dream of prosperity feels like a delusion, a fantasy from a bygone era, and that institutional explanations are probably better than cultural explanations for the rise of precariousness in the United States, and that the fact that elites benefited from globalization, from the opening of the Chinese economy to trade, the relocation of industry there, and in many ways benefited from immigration, and that there is a sense in which the failure of American political institutions to manage that transition in a way that preserved economic security for large portions of our population, that is a superior explanation to Vance's cultural explanation. So he may have had a genuine change of mind and heart, and in fact come around to a better perspective on these issues, which does not mean that Donald Trump's scapegoating of immigrants and liberal elites leads to a politics that is actually going to do anything to benefit the people who it appeals to. But having said that, at least there's an articulation of an explanation for their suffering that does not implausibly, exclusively blame them for the vulnerability that they have experienced, right? And so let me then add a few more things about JD Vance. The fact that this man said that Donald Trump might be the American Hitler, that his brand of politics was like cultural heroin, and then changed his mind, came round to Trump, and apologized is, I think, in fact, an advantage for Trump. It indicates both the hold of his ideas on the Republican Party, including some of the most articulate critics of him not too long ago, but also his dominance, the fact that his former rivals are subordinating themselves to him. This is critical to his image, his message, his appeal. Having said all of that, let me note very quickly, right, that JD Vance is very conservative, traditionally speaking, very populist. He, in fact, in many ways tried to out MAGA all the other candidates in Ohio, tries to be as clearly a Trump acolyte as can be, right, has said that if he were vice president in 2021, if he were Mike Pence, in other words, he would not have certified the outcomes of the 2020 election, the victory of Joe Biden, that in these respects, you add that he's obviously a white male, that Donald Trump really needs women in the first post Roe v. Wade election, that he really would begin to look invulnerable if he could double his share of African American and Latino votes from the previous election, and that JD Vance doesn't help him with women, with blacks, with Latinos, and there were alternatives available to Trump that would. Right. And please note that JD Vance did not do especially well in Ohio. It's not clear that the idea that he's a Midwesterner and therefore he helps in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin is anything but a theory. Right. So in this sense, I want to say this is a very confident pick. Right. This is a pick that says Trump doesn't think he needs help winning this election. What Trump wants to do is cement his hold over this party by designating his successor, right? And the one way in which JD Vance clearly helps Donald Trump is if Joe Biden remains his rival. JD Vance is young, less than half Biden's age, can say, I was not even alive when Joe Biden was first elected to office, right? And so there is some political calculus behind this, but I think much more than that, it reveals that at this moment, Donald Trump feels extremely confident, and that was definitely the tone of this convention. It really felt more like a victory celebration than a nominating convention, and we will have to see if this is overconfidence. And I want to immediately underline two things. There's a very good article in the Atlantic right now that is based on a reporter having been embedded with the Trump campaign, interviewing and watching in action the campaign officials. And what is clear is that Trump's campaign is built around the idea that he can defeat Joe Biden by a simple message. Biden is weak and Trump is strong. And please note, right, the debate performance, the faltering performance since then, especially some critical confusions in a press conference. Trump's surviving an assassination attempt, Biden's getting COVID and having to withdraw to his beach home, right? All of this seems to really cooperate. The circumstances of the last few weeks are cooperating with Donald Trump's message. Having said that, what also emerges from this report, I think is quite interesting. Donald Trump has redirected most of the money that would have gone into the Republican ground operation. Get out the vote, right? Knock on people's doors, make sure they've got rides to the polling place or that they filled out their mail-in ballot. And please don't, right? These elections, these last few elections have been decided really by who can mobilize the key voters and get them to turn their ballots in the critical states. Donald Trump has defunded that and moved the money into so-called election integrity, getting lawyers and advocates in place to monitor the election and to challenge the election results if it doesn't go his way or if he believes there's been foul play. And it does appear that Donald Trump really believes that the 2020 election was stolen from him, and he is conducting 2024 to prevent this from happening. And please don't you put that together with what actually happened on Thursday night, right? And so it was a very interesting night with Hulk Hogan speaking, right? With the leader of the Ultimate Fighting League speaking, right? Dana White, and without the conventional spouse introduction, and then with Donald Trump on stage recounting in rather graphic and almost peculiarly morbid detail his experience of having been shot a couple days later, right? And the episode in which he paid homage to the man who had died at the rally, that that felt, to my mind, peculiar, almost adolescent or narcissistic in the way in which it dwelled on his own experience of the event. But having said all that, it was a different Donald Trump. And I want to say one of the things about Donald Trump, two things, I guess, actually. The first is he remains deeply unpopular with the majority of the American people, right? 55% of us disapprove of him, and we don't just disapprove of him somewhat, we disapprove of him strongly, and we're fairly set in our views, and that makes it very hard for him to win a presidential election. He could have done what apparently the text of his speech asked him to do, or that he said he would do, which would be to go up in front of that stage and say, I just survived an assassination attempt. This has gone too far. We have to change the tone and tenor of American politics. We have to unify. We have to come together. We have to lower the temperature. Pick your language. And I am going to be a different kind of candidate from here forward, right? Because I recognize that in riling up my base, I also rile up my enemies, and this is dividing the country. And he did something like that in rather cloyingly stereotyped language for the first few minutes of the speech. But this was a speech that went on for 90 minutes. One of the reporters in the room who was watching from behind and looking at the teleprompter when Donald Trump decided to go off script said it looked like Donald Trump got bored. Right? He didn't feel that he could convincingly read the speech that had been written for him. And so he went right back into his stock stump speech. Crazy Nancy Pelosi, build the wall, the election was stolen. And so all of this to say, Donald Trump probably did very little to expand his base at this convention. His entire campaign is built on the idea that he is going to win against an old, weakened Democrat. Let us turn for a moment to Joe Biden then. And here you will recognize this slide. I have pointed out already to you that the Democrats and the party system as a whole, the Democratic Party, are hollowed out, in the language of Daniel Schlossman in a book he co-authored. And this is very different from the previous era, the New Deal era, in which labor movements and social movements anchored our political parties, and our political parties were active at the precinct level in civil society. We had party bosses, we had people who organized meetings and get-togethers, and there was an effective communication from the bottom up via the party. That is no longer the case. If Joe Biden is going to be convinced to get out of this race, it will most likely be the donors who convince him. And they have essentially closed the spigot on him in July, a critical period for his campaign. It's gone from the point where in April and May, the Biden campaign was bragging about having double the money that the Trump campaign has, to the Trump campaign having a huge financial advantage, and Joe Biden being incapable of raising significant cash from big donors, right? That's probably the pressure point that might get Biden out of this campaign. And please note, it's not the way political parties as potentially institutions that are functional for democracy are supposed to work. But what is new, and my thinking about this has evolved. I think I've gained a little bit more clarity. I want to sketch 4 scenarios for the Democrats, and they're different scenarios than what I was thinking about a couple weeks ago. And so I want to say, to frame this, that it seems to me how we assess these scenarios, what probability we assign to them, helps us to determine what we should want Joe Biden to do. And please note, ultimately, this comes down to Joe Biden and to his advisors and donors and other elites within the party. Let me start with the observation that Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, apparently Barack Obama, many of the party elite are urging privately, but increasingly also leaking publicly in order to increase the pressure, Biden to get out. And I think the reason is quite simple. They are getting internal polling that says your constituents no longer believe that Joe Biden is capable of running an effective campaign in 2024, let alone being an effective president in 2028. And if you continue to defend him, they will believe that you too are not credible, that you are lying to them, that you're acting in a greedy or partisan way and doing stuff that is bad for the country, right? And so this puts the people running for Congress, running for the Senate in the swing states, running for the House in the swing districts in a totally untenable position. On the one hand, they have to say, vote for me because Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again Republican Party are a genuine threat to our democracy, and you need us to check them. And on the other hand, they can't say, oh, and by the way, vote against Donald Trump and for Joe Biden, because the majority of Americans believe that Joe Biden's age is more disqualifying than Donald Trump's character, temperament, and convictions, right? And so that's just a terrible position for a congressional candidate to be in, but that's them pursuing their political self-interest, right? It's not, I think, the ultimate vantage from which to consider and arbitrate this question. I want to suggest that the real question is really twofold. What is the best way to keep Donald Trump out of the White House, or at least to keep the Republican Party from having complete control over the federal government? They already have a lock on the Supreme Court for the foreseeable future. The Supreme Court has told us quite clearly that they are unlikely to check Donald Trump in his second term in office. Then if you include the Senate, all of a sudden, right, Donald Trump is president, the Senate is Republican control, the federal judiciary continues to be transformed into a very different bench from what it's been. You include the House of Representatives, Donald Trump will not be impeached no matter what he does, but also much of the radical legislative agenda introduced in Project 2025, and I should be careful, I said legislative, it's a presidential agenda, it's an administrative or executive agenda, but it will be much easier to accomplish if the Republicans have control of Congress as well. All of the impediments to Project 2025 go away. So in the first instance, we should want to avoid that. If like me, you believe that this is not just bad ideas, bad politics, but actually a threat to the continuation of the traditions and institutions and culture that sustain the slow, unsteady, but nevertheless real progress of liberal democracy in the United States. And then, second perspective, which of the possible alternatives available to the Democratic Party is best for the Democratic Party, not only in 2024, but in 2028 and 2032, recognizing that the Democratic Party is the multiracial coalition party in the United States today, that it is the progressive party, that it has many problems and has failed in many ways, but that the success of the continuation of the progressive arc of American history probably depends on the Democratic Party becoming more effective in the coming decade. Which of these paths produces the greatest prospects for a strong Democratic Party emerging from 2024? Four different scenarios. Biden stays in the race and is incapable of effectively presenting his ideas or countering Donald Trump's ideas. He not only therefore loses, maybe he loses in a landslide, drags the Democrats down across the board. That seems to me to be the more likely scenario if Joe Biden stays in the race. He has, it appears, maybe found the floor in terms of the decline in his polling since the debate, but he's now behind in all of the swing states. And more than that, he now has to convince a substantial portion of the population who are already confirmed in their view that he's just too old to be an effective president, that they're wrong. And that's a message that's more difficult to convey than that Donald Trump is a danger to American democracy. But it turns out now that the American people will not vote for Joe Biden just because Donald Trump is a danger to American democracy if they believe that Joe Biden is simply not up to the job. So, second option or alternative possibility here, Biden stays in and he and the Democrats manage to win. And although I think this is a low probability event, it's not an impossible event. Please look at what Donald Trump did Thursday night. Recognize that he is a deeply unpopular and flawed candidate. He can't seem to really help himself, and he may do the kind of self-damage that actually opens the door for a Biden comeback. So not impossible, but improbable. Third alternative, that Biden steps aside, and then we have to have a highly compressed, probably quite chaotic contest within the Democratic Party to determine who succeeds him to be the presidential nominee for the party in 2024. And the result is that the party looks chaotic. And they end up nominating someone who isn't tested, who maybe doesn't do very well in the general election, but even more importantly, who lacks democratic legitimacy and who maybe even fractures the party. Let's assume for a moment that it's Gretchen Whitmer, right, from Michigan, a moderate. Let's assume that because Kamala Harris has been passed over, this alienates a large number of African Americans. It also alienates progressives because it's a moderate candidate when there were progressive alternatives. Um, this leads to defeat, maybe down ballot defeat. Maybe it's as bad or worse as Biden having stayed in. And maybe it's more damaging to the Democratic Party long term. I'm not convinced that it would be, because I think, frankly, a political party that refuses to listen to its constituents when they say you're nominating someone who we don't believe is up to the job. Not that we don't support, not that we find some downsides with, but we don't believe is up to the job. That says that this party is not listening to its own voters, is not doing its job. And that's damaging, maybe even more damaging than the Democratic Party fracturing and having to rebuild itself over the next 4 years. The fourth possibility, that Biden gets out, that there's a contest. Maybe it's more orderly. Maybe the Democrats actually organize a debate or two. Maybe they organize some sort of online forum for voters to weigh in. There's then an open contest in the nominating convention. The delegates vote, maybe several times, but eventually they hit on a candidate. That candidate comes out of the convention with some legitimacy, some capacity to unify the party, and turns out to be an effective candidate, right? And in that scenario, maybe the Democrats actually win and emerge from 2024 a revitalized, stronger party. I wish I were more confident. I wish there were enough information. Part of the problem with trying to assess the probabilities around these four scenarios is because there was not an open primary process, because we didn't have debates in January and February with Biden and Harris and Newsom and Whitmer and Buttigieg and others on the stage. These are nationally untested candidates. We don't know how they're going to perform, and they're going to have questionable legitimacy, right? So the Democrats have painted themselves, the party have painted themselves, and frankly, Joe Biden has painted them into a corner. I think we have to really worry about Biden's rhetoric right now. He's going to stay in the race because the people of the party have chosen him. What choice did they have? These were not contested primaries because Joe Biden and his campaign made it clear that they did not want competition, that they didn't consider Kamala Harris to be up to the job, that they were going to do their best to monopolize the donor money to keep everyone else out. And so we now face this choice without enough information to know how it would turn out. Nevertheless, having said all of that, I have to say, I do think the way I'm thinking about this right now, which of the bad outcomes is more probable, which of the good outcomes is more probable, that it seems to me the worst outcome that is most probable is the one where Biden stays in the race. The best outcome that is most probable is the one where he leaves the race. That doesn't mean it's risk-free, but that is, I hope, the reality that may eventually work on Joe Biden and prevent him from becoming the mirror image of Donald Trump, a man so divorced from reality, a man so vain, a man so invested in power that he does something catastrophic for himself and the the country. I will add very quickly, right, that I'm in a sense hoping that Joe Biden will become a statesman and not just a politician, and point out that in American history, George Washington exemplifies this, right? Turning in his military command after the Revolutionary War was won, becoming the quote American Cincinnatus, and refusing to accept the nomination for a third term when it wasn't clear who the alternative would be. Nobody else had the charisma or the popularity to unify the country. George Washington twice said, I trust the American people. I don't want to aggrandize my own power. And he goes down as one of the great presidents, one of the great statesmen in our history. That is a possibility that is open to Joe Biden right now. Coming back finally to violence. And I regret that I've spent so much time on other themes. Like I say, there's so much to talk about. But please note, I want to suggest that the assassination attempt on Trump is more chilling than it is surprising, because we have seen a growing wave of violence in American politics over the last decade plus, starting perhaps with the assassination attempt on Gabby Giffords, followed by an assassination attempt on Steve Scalise, followed by a plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, followed by the January 6th attack on the Capitol, followed by the hammer assault on Paul Pelosi by an assailant looking for Nancy Pelosi, followed by the assassination attempt on the former president. And I have on the board some of the unfortunate souls who have died in violence at political rallies, as well as the young man who has become kind of the poster child for committing violence at a political rally. And then finally, the chilling image of the noose hung in front of the Capitol, a noose that was erected as a symbol of vigilante violence and the growing legitimacy of the idea that the citizens of the United States can no longer trust their state and have to take the administration of violence into their own hands. I think that's the symbolism there. And please note that that noose was meant for Mike Pence, for somebody within the party, the number two person to Donald Trump, because he was showing disloyalty to Donald Trump. And so let me provide a little bit more evidence in terms of what's going on in the United States. The idea that a substantial portion of our population in a survey in 2023 now says that we need a leader who's willing to break the rules if that's what it takes to set things right. That's almost 40% of our population. That question is taken as a proxy for support of authoritarianism as opposed to democracy, for the rule of the strong leader as opposed to the rule of law. Again, these are norms as much as they are institutions. This is part of our political culture as much as it is part of our governmental structure. And I do think the commitment to the norm that sustains the institution is fraying, decaying dramatically. There is partisan asymmetry in this, right? That's striking to see that nearly 1 in 2 Republicans support the idea of a leader who will break the rules, but it's also similarly distressing that it's almost 1 in 3 Democrats. The other portion of the survey, which was comparing 2021 to 2023, asks about violence in particular, because things have gotten so far off track, the true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. In 2021, 15% of the population agreed with that statement. In 2023, it was up to 23%. Again, partisan asymmetry. a full 1 in 3 Republicans indicate on a survey that they agree with that statement, whereas it's only about 1 in 10 Democrats. But please note that the Democrats have more than doubled in the 2 years between 2021 and 2023 their agreement. I shouldn't say more than, they've essentially doubled, right? So the Democrats are coming round to the Republican position in a very rapid way. And this is part of what I'm referring to as the cycle of violence when countries move in this direction. If your opponents are willing to do violence to you, if you win, you're a damn fool not to be willing to protect yourself against their violence or reciprocate their violence. And I want to be as clear as possible. These are answers to survey questions. It doesn't mean these are people who are rushing to the barricades to actually do violent things, but it is one way of measuring the change in our culture. It certainly accompanies and helps to explain the crescendo of violence that my previous document indicated we've been experiencing. And please note, it's coming from our leaders. Violent rhetoric. It seems to be increasingly changing our norms. We are a society awash in guns. Many of those guns are military grade weapons that can shoot a large number of bullets very accurately a long distance. And some among us are young and perhaps confused, perhaps sick. It's not surprising in this environment that there is an increased incidence of violence. I want to say a few things more about this, so give me another couple minutes if that's okay. The first is the research I just reported builds on the research of 2 other political scientists, um, especially, not exclusively, but Liliana Mason of Johns Hopkins and Larry Bartels, who's a leading American political scientist. And Mason, in her recent book with Nathan Kalmo, we've talked about this before, did surveys, frankly, that no one had ever done before because it didn't seem relevant, but now it seems relevant, right? Would you say that members of the other party are a serious threat to the United States? 60% of Americans agree with that. Members of the other party are not just worse for politics, they are downright evil. 40% agree with that. And 20% say that many in the opposing party lack the traits to be considered fully human. They behave like animals. And she refers to these kinds of attitudes as indicating moral disengagement. If I think you have bad ideas, but you're basically a good or decent person, I will try to persuade you to change your mind. If I'm engaged with you in a conversation and it matters to me that you don't continue to have your bad ideas. If I'm convinced that you are a threat, that you are evil, that you're more like an animal, I'm a fool if I try to convince you you don't have the moral standing for me to assume that I can persuade you. I have to treat you like an enemy, like a threat. And that fundamentally alters our politics. And what Liliana Mason's work shows is that we are moving in this direction rather markedly in our politics. The other scientist, political scientist, Larry Bartels, very briefly, right? This is something we talked about together a while ago. This research is now 4 years old, almost exactly. And I show the technical presentation and then the graphical representation. And Bartels believed that this was fundamentally a Republican phenomenon in right 2020. And I have argued, I believe it's correct to say, that in the intervening 4 years, the Democrats have moved more in this direction. So maybe Republicans got there first, but Democrats are now moving in this direction, is what the survey research seems to show, not to the full degree of the Republicans. But I want to go back and try to understand how the Republicans got there first, because I think it matters to where we are. So, large portion of Republicans, nearly 50%, say that they strongly agree or agree with the idea that they may need to use force to save the American way of life. The third say they may have to take the law into their own hands because the American political system is so damaged, that they want strong leaders, and that includes people who will bend the rules, right, not constrained by the rule of law. And finally, that they don't trust elections. And so the central mechanism for peacefully settling our differences is not trusted by 3/4 of Republicans. When Bartels tried to explain this research, he considered the education level, the income level, the degree of political engagement, the geographic location of his respondents, and none of that correlated with these attitudes. What did correlate, however, was degree of ethnic antagonism. And political scientists and social psychologists have been measuring this for a long time. You ask questions about your attitude about immigration or civil rights or affirmative action or Barack Obama, and in getting those answers, you can't ask someone, are you a racist? Do you not like those people? Because they'll say no, because it's not considered socially acceptable. It's sanctioned to say yes to those questions. But if you get a good range of answers to the other questions, you can get an index of ethnic antagonism. And please note, right, that the people with low scores in terms of ethnic antagonism really don't endorse all of those ideas, despite being Republican or Republican leaning. But as you go up the scale of ethnic antagonism, support for mistrusting elections, using force if you don't win, wanting strong leaders who don't obey the rule of law, taking the law into your own hands goes up and up. And so, to be as clear as possible, what Bartels concludes is that what's really driving the erosion of democratic values in the United States is race and ethnic antagonism. He says, I find that a substantial number of Republicans endorse statements contemplating violations of key democratic norms, including respect for the law and for the outcome of elections, and eschewing the use of force in pursuit of political ends. The strongest predictor by far of these anti-democratic attitudes is ethnic antagonism, especially concerns about the political power and claims on government resources of immigrants, African Americans, and Latinos. The strong tendency of ethnocentric Republicans to countenance violence and lawlessness, even prospectively and hypothetically, underlies the significance of ethnic conflict in contemporary American politics. And coming back to Liliana Mason for a moment, she did this very interesting research and found ways of isolating voters with high levels of ethnic antagonism, and noted that their approval for the Republican Party from 2011 to 2017, if they were hostile to blacks, Hispanics, Muslims, or gays, did not go up. Their support for the Democratic Party went down. Their support for Donald Trump went up. And so what Donald Trump has done is to relocate voters with ethnic antagonism who used to, another way to put this is high outgroup hostility, who used to basically be evenly distributed between the two parties, to relocate them all into the Make America Great Again Republican Party. And so let me conclude and note, right, that we've got this racial sorting in American politics in which the Democratic Party essentially is a multiracial coalition that looks a lot like America as a whole. The Republican Party has remained very white. I want to be as clear as possible. There are some African Americans, there are some Latinos who don't like immigration, who don't like the fact that the United States is becoming more post-traditional, more cosmopolitan, and they too are moving in the direction of Donald Trump's Republican Party. But having said all of that, I do think it's fundamentally about immigration. And then I want to say one thing more, and this may also help to think a little bit about JD Vance and the transition that he's gone through. I think one of the reasons that Republicans and then Democrats, please note, are moving in this direction too, but Republicans are the first mover here, have stopped believing in these core democratic norms is because in many respects they've stopped believing that America is a functioning democracy. They have seen their standing in our society, their economic security, their children's prospects, their well-being decline for 50 years. And they have said again and again and again to their politicians, we need you to do something to help us. And their politicians have been incapable of doing it. They believe that the elite in the business world, in the legal world, in the political world, in the world of culture have stopped being responsive to them. That in these respects, not only has political but also social democracy stopped functioning in the United States. And at this point, civility seems to be a fool's errand. There's an old book by Herbert Marcuse called Repressive Toleration. And his claim, in essence, is when you're asked to tolerate the intolerable, tolerance is not a virtue. And when you're asked to be civil, when the whole system is stacked against you, maybe civility is not a virtue either. And so I don't want to go all the way down that path. Believe you me, I think down that path lies violence and discord and division and fracture. But we are moving down that path. And the events of the last week show very clearly that the rule of law, but also our political culture, whether we're talking about Aileen Cannon or an assassination attempt or the rhetoric at the Republican National Convention, all show that we're moving in this direction. So I think, again, this is a gut check moment. We, the American people, have to decide, is this the direction we want to move in? And if it's not, we have to take hold of our politics, our society, our institutions, and work to make them better. I want to say one thing in the aftermath of all that seriousness that is shamelessly self-serving. Give me one moment. I am doing an online course via a website over the next 6 weeks. 2 hours on Tuesday mornings, your time, Tuesday afternoons, my time, for 6 weeks in a row to really drill down on the issues in the 2024 campaign. We already have the opportunity to do this once a week. Some of the people watching this, because it goes onto YouTube, don't have that opportunity to engage in discussion. If anybody is interested, please email me. I'll also put a link in the YouTube video so you can follow that link if you want. I'd love to continue the conversation with anybody who wants to in a more sustained way. Who wants to start us out today with a question, a comment, a thought? Obviously, we have covered a lot of territory. John, you've got your hand raised. Flossie, you next, but I'll start with John today. Go ahead.
First, the failure to control the border by the Democrat administration is one of the great political/policy disasters of all time. Totally inept. Second, Biden reached a new height of pitifulness yesterday, or in yesterday's press, when he said that Obama and Clinton and everybody are no longer grateful to him for all they did for him and they've turned on him. Lord Almighty, it's like a 4-year-old. And third, it's a technical question. I have heard people say that if the Democrats do nominate somebody else, it sort of has to be Kamala Harris because no other candidate could draw on the millions of dollars raised by the Biden-Harris campaign, and perhaps not the whole campaign structure either, because of the campaign finance laws. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
So let me take the three comments in turn. So first, I want to say that it's more complicated than you made it out to be, John. And so, right, I think it was actually it was you who emailed me the article from the New Yorker when we were talking about the economic benefits of immigration, right? And how in many ways some of the inflationary pressure of the last few years has come down more quickly in the United States because of immigration. And just note, right, the complexity of this issue. And I will add immediately two things, right? The first is that this is the perfect poster child for the idea that in the 21st century, government is dysfunctional and we need a strongman leader. That is why Steve Bannon flagged this issue for Donald Trump 9 years ago. It's why Donald Trump has stuck with this issue like white on rice for his entire political career. It's the best way of saying you need a strong executive, bypass Congress and let the executive do it.
Sure, worked in Holland, worked in France. Well, not quite in France, but in Italy. Not to mention Hungary.
Oh yeah, no, it is the catnip for populist right-wing politics in the democratic world today, no doubt about it. And then I want to add, and JD Vance is actually, I think, a little clearer on this than Donald Trump, that this idea of, quote, conservative nationalism, that what immigration is fundamentally a threat to the identity of our country, right? It may be economically good for us, but it lets people in who don't look like us, who don't have our values. And I want to say, I get why that works in France and Italy and Norway and elsewhere, but JD Vance has written a whole book about being of Appalachian stock, right? Who are the people of Appalachian stock? Well, they're Scots and Irish who came here, admittedly 150 years ago, but they're not of this land originally. We're an immigrant nation. Having said that, I'll come back to something I said to you weeks ago on this issue. I think executive power, I think legal power is limited in its capacity to address this issue. This is a push and pull issue. If you can make 10 times what you make in your home country by going on the perilous journey to get across the border, through the deserts, across the Rio Grande, through the razor wire, there are a lot of people who are going to take that risk.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. The immigration question was a throwaway. I'm really interested in the question about whether other candidates can use the money raised by the Biden-Harris campaign.
Okay, I will go there next. And by the way, your second comment, I think Biden, is morphing into the mirror image of Trump. It's the sad tragedy. You know, he could be the next American Cincinnatus, or he could be the next American Lear, and he seems to be moving very much in the direction of Lear. And it's just the stubbornness. And you know, I do think part of the story here is that he feels he was passed over in 2016, and if they would have passed the baton to him, we never would have had Trump.
Yeah.
Right. But having said all of that, let's go to the money, right? And so it is absolutely correct, my understanding, not being a lawyer or let alone an expert in campaign finance law, that the Biden-Harris campaign cannot simply transfer their money to Pete Buttigieg or Whitmer or Newsom or whoever it turns out to be, right? Whereas if it remains Harris, she is entitled to that money, right? If Biden is no longer in the picture. That is correct. Here's, I think, the wrinkle that is worth noting, which is that the Biden-Harris funds, which are dwindling, please note, right? And dwindling in part because the donors are not supporting Biden as long as it's Biden, right? But those funds could be transferred to the DNC.
Oh.
And the DNC can then use them to spend on behalf of the candidates, right? And so it's not like they're in a lockbox where nobody else can get that money. It's just it's more convoluted if it's not Biden or Harris.
Good.
All right, John. Thank you for the good comments. Obviously, I found that provocative. Flossie, thank you for waiting. Unmute yourself and let's hear what you got to say.
Vance's position on abortion was very clear. It is not only clear, it's cruel. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. There is the women's vote. They may feel they are Republican, but any gal with an IQ over 10 wants the right to her own body. And I think I don't know that JD really means what he says, but he said it very clearly. No abortion. And not only that, even when a child is impregnated, and that's a crazy position, and it may take a lot of votes away from Trump. Only that. Okay.
Thank you, Flossie. And I'm going to put it in the following terms. Donald Trump is an incredibly strident, ideological candidate. JD Vance is even more strident, right? And so he's an extremist on practically every one of these issues. We could focus on abortion, which is a potential real liability for the Republicans, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. I don't think that there aren't some principled religious and moral grounds for being pro-life. It's not just being stupid if you're a woman. But having said that, 43% of Republicans think there should be a federal right to abortion, according to surveys conducted in 2023 and 2024. That's a huge portion of the Republican Party. And so Donald Trump is clearly trying to tone this down. And that's what he's done in the, I need to plug in my computer because it's going to die. What he's done in the Republican Party platform. But having said that, JD Vance does not help him in that regard. He hurts him, right? And you know, there were viable options for Trump to choose a woman, and that would have helped him tremendously. I do think the choice of JD Vance is an arrogant choice. It says that Trump thinks he's won in 2024. He appears to believe that he won in 2020 and that he's more concerned about securing the future of his movement than he is in winning in 2024. Please note that seems to be the same thing that's driving him to take the money out of the Get Out of the Vote campaign and redirect it to the election integrity campaign. Renee, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you take it down? Was that an accident? Well, I'm not hearing from Renee, and I can see that David has his hand up. David, you go ahead, and Renee, if you're hearing me and you want to say something, just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
I wanted to pick up on the analysis you did toward the end about the different stances of Republican and Democrats toward ethnicity. And it seems to me that fundamentally conservatives and liberals have a completely different theory about where all that money that used to go to the middle class and the working class is now. And the Republicans, particularly low-income Republicans, believe that it's all been transferred to undeserving minorities and immigrants. And they're the ones who are getting that privilege. Whereas liberal and progressive Democrats think it's all gone to the top 5% in this country. And I'm convinced by the previous analyses that you presented to us that the case for that loose change going up to the top 3 or 4% is more compelling than it going to the undeserving, folks at the bottom of the socioeconomic pool. So I just wanted to suggest that it's interesting to me that there are completely different theories about, where the money has gone.
I think it's the book Winner Take All Politics that has this nice diagram of what would have happened if we had stayed with the distribution of income we had in the 1980s as opposed to moving over to the distribution of income that we have now. And it points out that essentially what we've done is equivalent to redistributing over $100,000 per person for a period that's roughly a decade long from the bottom 90% to the top 10%. Right. And so I think you're absolutely right, David. I will say, and so there's two things here, right, that are worth noting. One of them is that in certain sectors of the economy, in the service sector, for instance, in hospitality or healthcare, for instance, and in construction, it does appear that on a regional basis, immigration has decreased wages for some workers, right? And so I think part of, the effort to meet people halfway, the effort to have civil discourse is also recognizing the truth, the kernel of the truth in what they're saying, right? And then, good policy can address that. There's also the crazy, stupid stuff that people like JD Vance says, that the reason that there's a housing crisis in the United States is because immigrants have taken all the housing. That's just, BS. But you look at least for the points you can agree with. And then I would add, right, we like scapegoating explanations. We like explanations, and let me put it a little bit more less provocatively. We like explanations in which there's an agent we can identify, preferably an agent that doesn't seem a lot like us, as opposed to structural explanations. So a large part of the explanation here is not just that the income has been distributed upwards, but that our economy functions in the 21st century thanks to globalization, and that's a vague term for the global integration of multiple supply chains in various sectors of production of goods, and automation, and the mobility of capital, and the mobility of technology. All of this stuff has made it such that people with the right kind of education and the right kind of financial capital make more of the money, take a larger slice of the pie. And part of the problem with this is, I think, it's hard to identify who's the agent there. I mean, I think part of pointing at Soros is to say it's people like him, right? But it's trickier to identify them, right? When FDR was making the case for the New Deal, he could point to the robber barons, right? You know, and we knew who they were, and we could see their lavish balls and their great Madison Avenue mansions, and we could say, yeah, it's them. In the 21st century, the global economic elite are harder to identify, harder to blame, and that, in a sense, pushes us in the direction of blaming immigrants. We've gone way over. David, do you have your hand up again?
I said we could start with the CEOs of most major corporations.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Wide-ranging conversation, dark themes. I do find some solace in talking this over with you and trying to better understand what's happening in our politics. I hope you do too. I'll just say again, ask Genevieve, ask John, if you don't already have my email address and you're interested in doing a longer course with me, please join me on Tuesdays. I'll put the link in the YouTube also. Take care, everyone. Be well. See you next week. Hang in there. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.